Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm so happy you're here. I am continuing my series called No Pathologies in IFS, where I basically take a diagnosis from the DSM-5 and explain it from a parts perspective. So someone asked me to focus on narcissistic personality disorder or narcissism. And there's a part of me that says I'm just going to sound like a broken record because it's the same thing with every single one of these diagnoses, really. It's a specific pattern of roles and behaviors that protective parts have taken on to protect a person from childhood or developmental trauma, attachment wounding, sometimes conditioning, but it's this strategy that their parts have taken on. And so I actually started making a PowerPoint presentation for a future workshop on codependency, and one of the slides is about narcissistic parts. So I'd like to share that with you. Okay. So, some of the requirements, or symptoms, I guess, that you would check mark in the DSM-5 for narcissistic personality disorder are things like entitlement, self-importance, grandiosity. There can be aspects of being punishing, controlling, manipulative. Empathy deficiency is a big one. Some can have hedonistic or risk-taking, can manifest in that way. And so let me go over those. So essentially, the understanding in IFS is that these are parts. These are a cluster of narcissistic parts who exhibit these behaviors, these strategies, in order to keep the person safe. And those cluster of parts are what I call front-facing in that person. So we all have narcissistic parts. And we'll see at the bottom that when they're not burdened, when they're not extreme, it actually, if you look at the last point here, it's how we have healthy self-love, healthy self-value, healthy self-agency. So you can think of the narcissistic parts as this very valuable quality that has gone to an extreme. And it is always in order to protect the person. So another thing that a lot of people don't think about with narcissistic parts is that they're actually working really hard to suppress or repress parts who hold shame, vulnerability, and/or empathy. So at the root of narcissistic parts is actually parts who feel deep shame and unworthiness, deeply unlovable. And you can think of it like this really, really soft, squishy core and this really hard armor over it, right? When people have raging parts or, they have this really tough exterior, you can actually be very confident that there is vulnerability and pain underneath that. When someone presents as arrogant and thinking highly of themselves, it can be really difficult to see and understand that underneath that is actually parts that feel deeply, deeply worthless, fallible, vulnerable, shamed, right? So it really is, a polarization, and the deeply vulnerable parts are inside and the deeply narcissistic parts are facing outside. So you only see those. But the extreme nature of the narcissistic parts is a direct indication of their opposite, of the extreme nature of how worthless that person actually feels at their core. Otherwise, they would not need to project such an extreme in such an extreme form, right? A person who has healthy self-love and self-value and self-agency doesn't need to assert that on the outside because they just know it, on the inside. So whenever you see this, you can automatically understand that there's actually deep pain underneath. It's very hard because the person's working, their system is working so hard to not show that to you. But their underlying wounds are shame, worthlessness, often a history of extreme neglect, abuse, misattunement, unpredictable attachment. And so they learn, usually as a very young child, that they have to be self-reliant and they have to really depend on themselves and see themselves as the savior, see themselves as the, the grandiose one, because that helps them survive, because they cannot depend on their caregiver. It's been shown to them time and time again that their caregiver is not dependable. So they have to turn the dependence on themselves and have this grandiose view of themselves in order to be convinced that they can survive without their caregiver. So it actually makes sense. Again, what's fascinating is, especially when it shows up in adults, is that these parts are actually very young, usually between the age of 2 and 4. This is a common developmental age, even 1, when children naturally are narcissistic, which means that they view themselves as the center of the universe. They view them, they can't see separate objects or separate people from themselves. Everything is part of themselves. And so they have a hard time differentiating. And you've probably heard the term arrested development. In some ways, this is what's happening from an IFS perspective, is that when a person is displaying these narcissistic qualities, it really is like they are back at age 2 to 4. And I'm going to do more videos. Actually, I'm going to do a video about codependent parts, and then I'm going to do another video about the relationship that happens between a person whose outward facing dominant parts are a cluster of narcissistic parts and a person whose outward facing dominant parts are a cluster of codependent parts, because they tend to attract each other, and what happens there and the damage that can happen. So when I talk about these parts, and it's to help you understand that when a narcissistic person, or I don't want to say a narcissistic person, a person with dominant narcissistic parts interacts with you, to simultaneously understand 2 things. 1, it's not about you at all. It is not personal. And 2, sometimes this most self-led thing you can do as a person interacting with them is to take your system away from them. And understanding the roots and why these parts are acting out doesn't mean that you need to put yourself in harm's way, or that you can fix them or save them or anything like that. So I want to make that clear. But it is really helpful to, you can say, I love you. I see that what you're doing is not about me, and that there's a reason why your parts have learned to protect you in this way, and you have deep trauma underneath it. And I love and care about myself. I have healthy self-love and value and agency. And so, until yourself can heal those parts in you, I need to take my system away from you. I love you, and I can't be around you. I love the definition of boundaries of, it's the distance between you and I at which I can value both you and I simultaneously. It's very, very difficult to be in a relationship with a person who has a cluster of narcissistic parts that are active and dominant in their system. It's very difficult also because these parts, by their very nature, prohibit a person from getting help or even from recognizing that they need help, because they're so convinced that they don't need help, that they're independent, that they are the best at everything, that no one can help them. So sometimes practitioners, I'm going to stop sharing. Sometimes practitioners and therapists will say, it's impossible for a narcissistic person, they'll say, to heal. I will say it's difficult. I will say it is not up to the codependent person to fix them. They cannot do it. But it is possible for a person with a cluster of narcissistic parts to begin to heal, to begin to have a little bit of insight. And particularly, there's hope for me in the framework of internal family systems. Because when you understand that at the root is debilitating shame, that if these narcissistic parts don't do their job, the next in line is suicide, because they cannot handle the immense shame and worthlessness at their core. So IFS is hopeful because it's non-shaming, it's non-pathologizing. That's why I don't even like to use the word narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. If this person can understand, I am not a narcissist, I am not a monster, I have parts who are narcissistic, and they've learned to do this for a reason, and they can begin to have compassion even on their own narcissistic parts. That's when there's hope for healing. But again, another person cannot make them see that, cannot rescue them from that. It has to come from their own experiences. And sometimes they begin to see it when a person does take their system away and says, I know this is impersonal, but I'm not going to, allow my system to be harmed by it. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions about narcissistic personality disorder, narcissism, the cluster of narcissistic parts in yourself, in a loved one, feel free to put them in the comments below.